Welcome to our fireside chat, driving the flywheel faster on the journey to a net zero future. I'm Vijay Vaitiswaran. I'm the Energy and Global Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Mahmoud Mohiuddin, UN Climate Change High-Level Champion from Egypt. As we approach COP28, how might the momentum be maintained? We've trying to get a flywheel effect to build on the progress in Sharm el Sheikh as we head towards Dubai and making sure that these programs are enduring rather than just hot air is the challenge of the moment. To help us with that, to think through some of the key initiatives, let me turn to Mahmoud. Mahmoud, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Vijay. It's a great honor to participate in this important event and have this discussion with you.
Now, there's some specific areas we can talk about, but at the highest level, in terms of keeping that momentum going, what do you think is the most important challenge to overcome or the most important opportunity to seize as we head towards the forthcoming COP?
Well, it's very much important to get matters into context because as we are trying to push the climate action agenda further, as we should, there are many other things happening at the same time, including the challenges facing the Sustainable Development Goals at large. And we should be forgetting that climate action is one of them as Sustainable Development Goal number 13. And there are many efforts towards that kind of work led by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and many leaders. There are many efforts as well on accelerators like the accelerator for the SDGs, stimulus for sustainability, calls for actions. Many summits are happening as well this year. Few of them are related to climate action at the leaders level, either in France or Senegal, or special events at the margins of Anga in September, or of course the big event in COP28 in Dubai this year. And at the same time, there are many crises overwhelming the global system. Some of them are inherited from the previous years, and some of them are just quite recent. So within this context, we need really to put the acceleration of climate action, reducing the emissions by 2030 by half, doubling the efforts in adaptation, launching the loss and damage fund, and getting more serious actions towards finance, how to finance all of these efforts, either in mitigation, adaptation, and the loss and damage.
Well, you've put a lot on the table, but one thing I did want to unpack a little bit. You talked about other events unrelated necessarily to the climate process. There is a vigorous debate about the likely impact of the war in Ukraine on the climate agenda. Where do you fall out? Has energy security rising to the top of consciousness now derailed or set back the climate agenda? Or do you think it may have accelerated concerns and opportunities?
We felt that strongly during the preparations of the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda, and it didn't impact the outcomes, but it really made it like an uphill struggle to get the momentum, to get the political coherence and political push behind major items on the agenda. And of course, we are doing this kind of work on climate action while many societies, many economies are overwhelmed by the food price increase, the energy crisis, and of course the impact of many policies on inflation and interest rate that made it as well difficult for countries to finance climate action because of the debt burden. So the solutions to that is to put climate action within a holistic approach. So, and as much as we can, as we try to do it in Sharm el-Sheikh, make sure that climate solutions are part of the agenda. If, as you rightly alluded to, issues related to energy is in everybody's mind, how investments in renewables and alternative energy, from wind farms to solar energy to the new strong arrival in the system like green hydrogen, could really provide some good work to support access to energy. That could be a solution to the midterm, but we need really to start it now.
One particular point there, you mentioned rising prices, inflation. We are seeing as a result an era of higher interest rates that we're entering. Renewables particularly tend to be capital intensive projects, more sensitive to interest rates. How do you think we can help unlock climate finance for developing countries in an era where we're entering into where the financing has become somewhat more challenging for those initially capital intensive projects?
You are very much right, especially for a line of business that had been very much dependent on debt instruments to finance projects in mitigation and in adaptation. Globally, more than 60% of finance for climate is based on debt. For developing economies and emerging markets, the share could be even higher than that, could be north of 75%. And with the rising interest rates, that definitely complicates matters, especially that many of the projects related to climate action, especially in the adaptation front, they are more into the areas that has public social gains, not necessarily always with commercial returns. That should really get us back into the drawing board as we did in preparations for a pipeline of projects. This was a kind of a big challenge that we tried to respond positively to when there was a promise in Glasgow through the GFANs to mobilize assets behind climate action. But one of the main questions then, we have the money, we don't really have the projects or the bankable or investable projects. So we worked hard during last year to prepare around 400 projects. This was joint work between the climate champions, some consultancy firms like BCG, and we worked closely with the regional economic commissions of the UN system. And we have these projects fully owned as ideas and concepts by line ministries in more than 100 countries. And we filtered them down to around 120 projects as examples of bankable and investable projects. Some of them would require some major grants and credit enhancements to make them feasible down the road. The good thing that in the mitigation front, the commercial returns could justify going forward with many of these projects. In the adaptation front, some sort of bundling through getting projects in water management, food system closer to the energy sector. But again, these would require more concessional finance, which should bring more the multilateral development banks like the World Bank, the regional development banks, stronger to support the efforts to get these projects in the field.
So this is a bundling together of opportunities in a sense. I understand there was a series of regional finance forums where the idea was to facilitate investment flows to these projects. In addition to that, are there instruments, whether they're hybrid financing tools, more innovative kinds of financing instruments that could come from the international institutions? There's been some discussion of possibly some mechanisms for protecting investors from currency exchange risk or forex risk that the World Economic Forum has put forward. Do you see a role for instruments like that or mechanisms in addition to the approach that we've already talked about?
Absolutely. And we're not going to be reaching the targets without two things, without leveraging public finance, domestic and external public finance, getting more and more private sector to be incentivized to engage in these projects. And we cannot really do that as well without more financial innovation that could really facilitate some of the work. And let me just give you a few examples on that. We are revisiting the whole thing related to the $100 billion, the famous promise from the Copenhagen Times. And we're trying to mobilize these funds in order to leverage private finance to take issues related to risks more seriously, provide guarantees, taking care of first loss in some of the projects, but this should be conducted through the multilateral development banks and some of the specialized funds like the Green Climate Fund. The two presidencies of COP26 and COP27 commissioned Nick Stern and Vera Songwe with a dozen of experts with them, and they managed to identify the gaps of finance, and they gave hints on how to bridge these gaps. We are continuing this work with the presidency of COP28 and focusing more on financial innovation. And I would really say that I like to highlight three areas of work. One is related to debt reduction mechanisms. And we have seen some good examples on debt swaps, either to invest in nature or to invest in climate. And now we are scaling them up. We have seen good examples coming from Belize and Seychelles, but they were very much based on project finance. Good as they are, but we need to have more of a scale when it comes to funding. And that's why KPI-based projects, linking them to the nationally determined contributions of countries, as it happened in the case of Barbados, could be the way going forward, because it gets matters from projects into policies and institutional reforms at the same time. We have seen as well some good variety, which could be the second area of work, more bonds, more financial instruments linking themselves strongly to sustainability with better definitions of ESG, perhaps benefiting as well from this important report led by Minister McKenna of Canada, the former Minister of Climate and Environment, who led a commission based on the UN calls to get matters related to greenwashing fixed. So new definitions, new standards, new disclosure related to ESG are very much in place. The third area of work on that is related to carbon markets. And I'm happy that COP27 had seen the launching of the first voluntary market for carbon, the African Carbon Market Initiative, which is now supported by philanthropies, including Rockefeller, and it has behind it as well the Sustainable Energy for All of the UN supporting it, with a good plan for implementation in the next 3 years with partnerships with the private sector.
Now, it has to be noted, there have been some challenges in getting the carbon markets going. You had alluded to Catherine McKenna's report in passing the greenwashing report. There have been concerns about the integrity side of the equation. What do you think we need further beyond the excellent report, in fact, which The Economist wrote up at the time of COP27 from the UN Commission and McKenna? Beyond the report, how do we really turbocharge that market for voluntary carbon markets to go beyond that, perhaps even to pick up on perhaps Secretary Kerry's idea that was promoted to have a stronger government-involved carbon markets?
Right. I think these reports we mentioned, including the one by Minister McKenna and her colleagues, are basically there to be operationalized and implemented. And that would require in the next weeks and months engagements with standard setters, with regulators, because part of the greenwashing is attributed to the fact that we don't really have adequate standards to follow. And when we are asking the business sector to comply with standards, the most genuine of them, they would tell you, well, we are very keen to do that, but which standards then? I think there should be some sort of good agreements with the standard setters in this area to make it as easy for accountability and compliance as we see it today with accounting standards, with auditing standards, with the rules coming from Basel, for instance. They should be as simple, as straightforward to understand for the professionals, and then to get them implemented. This is a major priority. When it comes to issues related to the recommendations coming on partnerships in areas related to the carbon market, this is very much, and now given that these are new initiatives, unlike the compliance with ESG, because ESG has been around for quite some time, so are adjusting some efforts that are already in place. But when it comes to new initiatives like ACME, it's just 5 to 6 months old. So those who are creating it are really creating it with some sort of a very strong focus on how to do that properly from the very beginning and adhering to the rules of engagement. So possibilities of avoiding greenwashing and confusion in the market should be minimized.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And just in the time remaining, an area that often gets overlooked, but one which you did mention, I want to spend a moment on adaptation. As you know, much more of the resources tend to go towards mitigation than adaptation, even though it's increasingly clear that we're in a world where adaptation is beyond necessary. It's urgently required. What do you think are some promising ideas to push this forward, including perhaps picking up on the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda?
Right. Let me just share with you the logic behind what you just said now from my perspective. If we were doing fantastically well in mitigation, we shouldn't really be bothering ourselves with adaptation today. But it's very much the case that the first line of defense against climate change had been compromised. That's why you need to invest more in adaptation. And as you know, Sharm el-Sheikh produced this comprehensive Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda of 5 areas of work: food systems, water management, coastal areas, areas of settlement, and infrastructure as areas of focus for investment. The challenge in all of these areas that so far the funding is around 98% globally, based on what came out from the Adaptation Center in the Netherlands. 98% comes from public sector. Only 2% got the interest of the private sector. This issue could be solved, as I mentioned before, through bundling, getting the nexus of energy, water, food system, and adding infrastructure to it. We need really to get ourselves more seriously with MDBs, the multilateral development banks. Currently, the average of funding for climate action is like 75 to 80% mitigation and 15 to 20% in adaptation. That should be at least 20% now for mitigation, and 20% for mitigation and 80% for adaptation. You can tell me, well, the expectation was 50-50. I tell you, we have seen in many countries today that they can get the private sector easy. If we are preparing the projects, doing de-risking, the private sector can be able more and more to invest in mitigation. What is really missing now is to do more on adaptation. 50-50 is the minimum, but if you are going to balance matters, I think we need to get the focus more now, more positive bias towards adaptation. Otherwise, we'll be requiring more funding to the loss and damage, because this could be the loss and damage is the third line of defense. First line, mitigation. Second line of defense is adaptation. Third line is loss and damage. And that requires definitely complete shift in the paradigm of financing climate and I would say development at the same time. There is no dichotomy between taking finance for climate seriously and development seriously, because all of what we mentioned now are, yes, they are very important for climate, but they are part of the sustainable development goals.
You mentioned loss and damage. It was obviously a very contentious issue at Sharm el-Sheikh in the end with an agreement. Very briefly, what do you see happening on that front in coming months?
I know that by the end of March, there was an agreement to have the first meeting for the committee, the 24 member committee responsible for getting the rules of engagement, the governance, sources of finance, and allocation criteria. And from now until we meet in Dubai in November, December this year, there should be a full plan with earmarked actions for the loss and damage fund. And we see a good opportunity as well for the private sector, especially insurance companies and many of the NGOs and foundations to support the work, at least in capacity development, sharing knowledge, technical assistance. But in terms of risk assessment and part of the core lines of business of insurance sector, we see an opportunity as well for the insurance sector to work closely with the state actors in terms of supporting the operations of this fund. What I hope to see is not to spend years and years trying to establish the fund, see the best capital to host it, and more years on areas related to governance. As important as they are, we need really to expedite the process, and perhaps the most plausible way of doing matters now is to establish a kind of a fund within one of the existing institutions until we see a full-fledged kind of operation established as a kind of a standalone operation. We don't need to make the perfect enemy of the good.
To stick with our analogy, to get the flywheel moving. Very good. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to look forward to, Mahmoud. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All the best.